2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Speaking of great things, there's a book hot off the press called The FitzGerald Brothers Circus, and author and creator of this terrific book, Gillian Arrighi, joins us in studio this morning. Gillian is a senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle for Creative and Performing Arts. Gillian, congratulations on your awesome book.
Thanks, Meryl. It's great to have it out.
It's really just hot off the press last week, released.
It is, yes.
Lovely.
That's right.
And I will confess I didn't get a chance to read it from cover to cover because it is just so detailed, but you've got some beautiful pictures in there as well. And you've focused, it was really, for all intents and purposes, your life's work for many years. It was your PhD, wasn't it?
That's right. So it was my PhD. So that was awarded 2007. So the years 2004 to 2007, I was completely immersed in retrieving the history, the lost history of this really significant popular entertainment organisation. They were the largest popular entertainment organisation in Australasia in the late 19th century. But their history was really, to all intents and purposes, lost. So throughout those 4 years, I spent a lot of time trawling the archives in Australia and New Zealand. But a certain amount of research was done after the completion of the PhD as well, since there were questions I hadn't answered, and some of those questions didn't get answered until I, went to other archives, for example, the British libraries and other newspaper sources.
So let's get to the crux of it. Who were the FitzGerald brothers, and why did their circus change the way we thought of ourselves in Australia so much?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were colonial born. They were born of Irish parents. Some of the family were born in New Zealand. Some were born in Australia. So they regarded themselves in this period prior to Federation as being Australasian. Their story was a rags to riches. So that became very, very popular in the late 19th century. It's this period when Australian national identity was forming, and it was forming around this idealisation of the bush. Okay. And of, these brave sort of intentions such as pluck and, you've
stoicism.
got stoicism, pluck, imagination, entrepreneurship. So their story, in a period of 5 years, they went from a sort of pony trap circus in the western part of Queensland to being the largest circus that had ever come out of Australasia. And they were sort of championed by the Bulletin newspaper and by all of the leading newspapers in Melbourne and Sydney. And in that 5-year period, they really sort of rode on the popular politics of the time. So they were great supporters of the burgeoning labour movement. They were closely allied with, the workers and the labour movement.
Was it in fact entertainment for the masses as we first knew it, in a sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
I got that from your book, actually. Yeah.
And if we think of it, that in this period, the gross populations of, say, Melbourne and Sydney would have been roughly 250,000.
So not many, in other words.
Compared to now. But at their height, their circus tent housed 6,000 people, and they would run for periods of 6 weeks and sometimes 2 months in each of these cities. So they were churning an enormous amount of people at the box office.
And you mentioned going from a pony trap circus to a full-blown circus. Just having a look at one of the listings that you've made, they had 2 lionesses, Queenie and Molly, a male tiger, 2 female tigers. They had a leopard and a panther, as well as ponies, dogs, elephants, just an incredible array. And although we don't look favourably upon the exploitation of animals anymore in circuses, that was an enormous feat to have them shipped here. And when I read the story about them coming on a Dutch boat to Fremantle and just the lengths they went to get those animals, having said that we don't approve of it anymore, it was an incredible feat.
An incredible feat, also terribly expensive. But I think the other thing is to remember they travelled also with an enormous stud of horses. So their horses, in this period when horses were so beloved of Australians, they had some champion bloodstock. But more than that, they travelled with a large, well, they called it a menagerie. We would say it's the beginnings of a zoo. So they travelled to remote parts of Australia as well, introducing the population to these wonderful exotic animals, but they also travelled with a lot of Australian Indigenous animals. And so they rode also on this narrative of science and enlightenment for the people.
And they probably did introduce a lot of people to animals that they would have never dreamed of seeing. The other forefront for the FitzGeralds, as I read it, is true multiculturalism. They were an international organisation. They had people from all over the world working for them.
They did, not just in the ring as high-profile performers, but, you know, a visit to the circus site, you would see a huge mix of races as workers on the site. So they had Indigenous performers. So they were one of the few organisations to actually give a show space to Aboriginal Australians, but they also imported the first team of sumo wrestlers to ever leave Japan. They came to Australia and New Zealand for a year-long contract. But the circus site was a multicultural workspace.
And the other workspace, it seems, in a time of when there was really no equality for women to speak of, they were also forerunners in giving women not only a job but the spotlight, but not just as kind of eye candy, if you like. They were true stars in their own right, these women.
They were. They were. I mean, they were aerialists and equestrians at the forefront, you know, of those skills at that time in the development of the circus. They were stars in their own right, some that were imported stars from overseas, but they also gave plenty of space to up-and-coming Australian women. The other thing that they played a lot with was gender play. So we get cross-dressed aerialists and we get cross-dressed equestrians in the circus as well.
But when you say that, it wasn't men pretending to be women, which was often the case. It was women pretending to be men or dressing more masculinely and taking the mickey that way.
In both directions.
Yeah,
actually, in both directions, yeah.
Now, can you tell me, I know this has been such a big part of your life, but have you got a quick favourite story from the FitzGeralds or something that sort of really stands out to you?
I've got a stack, but there are a couple. One of my favourites was Charles Peart. He was a very young high diver who came from England. He was about 23, 24 years old. And he had this, perhaps a death wish, but he did an extreme high diving act. And sometimes the high part of the tent wasn't high enough and he'd go out and dive off high bridges or high tall ships. And he actually did die as a result of a high dive at opening night at one of the big seasons in Sydney. So his high dive into this tiny little tank, shallow tank of water, did go wrong. No one in the audience realised, but he died at St Vincent's Hospital later that night. So it's a really poignant story. But I think one of my other favourites is a talking horse.
Not Mr. Ed.
No, he was actually called Mohammed the talking horse, which is not something we'd feel comfortable these days. But I think, you know, it was such a slick act that it generated an immense amount of correspondence in the newspapers about how the trick worked. Because his owner, Probasco, said, well, he's not a trick horse, he's an educated horse. And it stimulated a terrific amount of public correspondence about how did this act work and how was this horse able to infallibly knock with his hoof or answer the questions in some other way.
Well, you'll have to read the book to find out the answer. Gillian Arrighi, thank you so much for your book, for your effort, for coming to share a little bit of Australians' FitzGerald Circus with us. And I know a lot of people will have been brought up going to the circus in one way or another and relating to the stories that you tell in the book. And if all else fails, we can run away to the circus.
Thanks, Meryl.
2NURFM, Meryl in the morning.